An Acceptable Time by Madeleine, Chapter 12. The sun burned like a bronze shield, a strange heat reflected from its fires, touching the water with a phosphorescence. It was hotter than it had been when she swam across the lake. The guards kept glancing in her direction. Now that Og had escaped, the guards would be even more careful with Polly. This was the Indian summer that she had been told about. Indian summer that came in November, with a last reminder of summer before the long cold of winter. But this was hotter than she had expected Indian summer to be. Hotter than it should be? Perhaps weather patterns were different 3,000 years ago. Across the lake, lightning played, and thunder was always in the background, an accompaniment to the steady beating of the drums. Tynak's people drumming for rain. The sound intensified hour by hour. For rain or for sacrifice? The pallet of ferns was soggy with heat and humidity. She pulled it to the entrance of the lean-to, hoping for a breath of air. Lay back with her eyes closed. A warm breeze touched her gently. In her mind's eye, she saw her room, which had once been Charles Wallace's room. Looked out the window to the view of field and woods, and the low, ancient hills that gave her a sense of assurance that the jagged mountains did not. She moved her imaging to her grandmother's lab, where she was always cold, tried to feel her feet on the great stone slabs that formed the floor, chilling her toes. Then in her mind's eye, she looked out the kitchen window to see her grandfather on his tractor, saw Bishop Kalubra at the stone wall, Louise the Larger, coiled up in the warm sunlight, saw Dr. Louise in her daffodil-colored sweater walking across the field toward her brother. In this manner she moved through 3,000 years. In eternity, her own time and this time in which she was now held, waiting, were simultaneous. If she died in this strange time, would she be born in her own time? Did the fact that she had been born mean that she might escape death here? No, that didn't work out. Everybody in this time died sooner or later. But if she was to be born in her own time, wouldn't she have to live long enough to have children, so that she would at least be a descendant of herself? Corrales understood riddles such as this one. Polly shook her head to try to clear it. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. What did Einstein's equation really mean? Did her grandfather understand it? Her grandfather at home in her own time. Her grandmother, Dr. Louise. They must all be frantic with anxiety. Dr. Louise would not know what had happened to her brother, who had gone off in hiking shoes. And on this side of time, across the lake, the bishop, Corrales, Tav, Cub, Aniral, what were they doing? If Og had reached them, they would be asking each other how they could help. They would be trying to make plans. Leaves drifted down onto the skins of the lean-to. The air was so heavy with humidity that she felt she could reach out and squeeze it. She looked up as she heard a strange dragging sound, and coming toward her was Clep, supported on one side by the old healer, on the other by a young warrior. Clep hopping on his good leg. "Clep!" she cried out. "You'll hurt your leg!" The healer and his warrior gently placed him down next to Polly. His face was ashen and beads of sweat broke out on his forehead. "Clep, what have you done? You shouldn't have come." Polly knelt by him. "I have spoken with Tynak," Clep whispered. The healer gestured to the warriors, who glanced wonderingly at Clep, then drew back several paces. Then the healer knelt on Clep's other side and examined the broken leg, lifting the compress of moss on the wound where the skin was cleanly healing, but was still pink and new-looking. He held his hands over it, shaking his head, mumbling, "There is fever again. He should not be upset." Polly understood him to say, "In his tent he did fret. He held his hands over the leg, glanced at Polly, nodded. She held her hands out too, just over his. The healer withdrew his right hand to place it over Polly's, not touching, hovering delicately. Again she felt the tingling warmth, and then a strange heat, as though they were drawing the fever out of Clep's inflamed skin. Then the heat was gone, and there was a sense of color, of gold of sky in early morning, gold of butterfly wings, gold of finch in flight. The pinched look left Clep's face, and his whole body released its tension. He looked gratefully at the healer and Polly. "Thank you. I am sorry to have caused trouble. I had to come." He looked pleadingly at the healer, who squatted back on his heels. "I have spoken with Tynak," Clep said again. He said that you have caused the rain across the lake with the angel you took from him. I didn't take the angel from him, Polly pointed out. He tried to take it from me. He is angry and he is fearful. He says that you are withholding rain from us, and the people are angry. With Clep, Polly could not understand every word, but enough to get the gist of what he was saying. I don't control the rain, she said. I want it to rain here as much as you do. The healer murmured, but Polly guessed that he was saying that a broken leg was easier to heal than anger. Briefly, Polly closed her eyes. Her voice shook. I thought when Zach kidnapped me, it was for me to be the sacrifice so the healer would fix his heart. The healer shook his head. No, no. And from his mumblings, she guessed that it was Tynak who had prevented the healer from working with Zachary until Polly came. A healer heals. Clep said, that is what Zach thought, what Tynak wanted him to think, maybe what he still thinks, but the people do not care one way or the other about Zach. They are tired of raiding to get food. They want the sacrifice so there will be rain. Polly thought of Anarel singing her hymn of joy to the mother after she had placed the flowers on the altar, of the people of the wind greeting morning and evening with harmony. Your God demands sacrifice and blood, or the rain will be withheld. Clep said what she took to mean, for each person the God is different. There is a different God? No, each person sees differently. Clep, what do you believe? That you are good, that you have nothing to do with rain or drought, that your blood is your life, and while it is in you, you will use it for good. But the power is when you are alive, not when you are dead and the blood is spilled on the ground. He added, Anarel says I am a druid, and smiled. Polly was listening intently, translating Clep's words as he spoke into words she could comprehend. The healer has much power, Clep continued. I have seen him bring back life where I thought there was none. But even he cannot bring your blood back into you if it is spilled out of your body. The healer spoke. His vocabulary was far more in his hands than in his mumbling, and this time she could not understand what he was saying. Clep translated, Go back to your own place. I wish I could. Clep turned to the old healer. They spoke together for a long time, and Polly could not understand what they were saying. Finally, Clep nodded at the healer and turned to Polly. Tonight, when the moon rises, there will be much noise, many people. We will help you get to the lake. Stop the arrows and spears so you can swim. You can do this? Clep was fierce. There will be no sacrifice. The healer has great power. No one would dare throw a spear at him. No one would dare try to stop him in any way. He will protect you as you run to the water. It was a slim hope, but it was a hope. She did not think she could make the swim again, but better to drown than be put on that terrible altar rock. Thank you, I am grateful. You were good to me, Clep said. Your people of the wind were good to me. I would become one with Anarel. From you I have learned much. I have learned that I love. Love, that is a good word. Yes, it is a good word. What I do not do just for you, though I hope I would do what I do even if it were not for Anarel. But if you were sacrificed, do you think the people of the wind would let me see Anarel to love? Do I learn love and then let love be sacrificed along with you? Again, his brow beaded with sweat. Will you swim? I will swim. She tried to sound certain for Clep's sake. The healer spoke again. Clep said, You have the gift. The healer says you must serve it. Tell the healer I will try to serve the gift. As surely as Dr. Louise had done all her life, so would Polly try to do. Clep nodded, looked out at the village, where people talked in small groups, the sound ugly menacing. I will stay with you. I cannot do much, but my presence will help. The healer looked at Polly. We'll stay. Surely the healer's presence would keep the people from coming to the lean-to and dragging her out, at least until the full moon rose, and the very fact that these two men, the young and the old, were with her, cared enough to stay with her, filled her with warmth. She asked, Clep, what about Zachary? I came back across the lake with you because of Zachary. Zach? Oh, he is of no importance. She did not understand. She repeated, But I thought I was to be sacrificed so that his heart could be mended. That is... Clep searched for words. That is not in the middle, not in the center. Well, yes, she could understand that Zachary was peripheral, but did he know it? If rain comes, if the people are quiet, then the healer, Clep glanced at the ancient man who remained squatting back on his heels, as comfortable as though he were in a chair. He will try to help Zack because he is a healer. Where there is brokenness, he must heal. Tynak wanted you to think that Zack was important because he thought the line was drawn close between you, that you loved him. No, Klep. I know that the line is between you and Tav, not Zack. Again she shook her head. Where I come from, it is too soon. I may sense a line between Tav and me, but love. She could not explain that not only was she not ready to give her heart to Tav or anyone else, that she had much schooling ahead of her, that in her time she was too young, but also that her time was 3,000 years in the future. Perhaps in the vast scheme of things, 3,000 years wasn't much, but set against the span of a single lifetime, it was enormous. Thunder rumbled. She looked across the lake and saw dark sheets of rain. Klep looked at it. Ah, Polly, if you could bring rain here. Oh, Klep, would that I could. The healer remained squatting on the ground just inside the shadow of the lean-to. The strange light gave a greenish cast to his face, and he looked like an incredibly ancient frog. His voice was almost a croak. Healer will not let healer go. His ancient eyes met Polly's. Not only was he offering her his considerable protection, he was calling her a colleague. Groups of villagers were muttering, hissing, sounding like a swarm of hornets, looking toward the lean-to, but not coming close. Had it not been for Klep and the healer, there with her, for her, she was not sure what would have happened. The storm across the lake moved away, farther away, and the brazen sun glowed through angry clouds. The heat was wilting the leaves which were left on the trees, and they drifted down, sickly and pale. Polly closed her eyes, felt a hand touching hers, an old dry hand, the healer. A cool wind began to blow, touching her cheeks, her eyelids. The waters of the lake rippled gently against the shore. The angry people fell silent. Slowly the sky cleared, the thunderheads dissipated, but the sound of drums continued. The day dragged on. Klep slept, lying on his side, breathing like a child, hand pillowing his head. The healer, too, lay down and his eyes were closed. But Polly thought that he was not asleep, that he was holding her in a still center of quiet. She could feel her blood coursing through her veins, her living blood keeping her mind, her thoughts, her very being held in life. Would she give up that blood willingly? Where was Zachary? Was he still greedily grasping at life, any kind of life, at any expense? There was no willingness in him, no concern except for himself. Did he really understand what he was demanding? There was no sunset. The daylight faded, but there was no touching of the clouds with color. It simply grew darker. Darker. Cook fires were lit. The muttering of the people began anew. Here the full moon would not lift up above the great trees of the forest, as it did for the people of the wind, but would come from the lake, rising out of the water. She heard with horror a hissing of expectation. Tynak strode into the center of the clearing, looking first across the lake, then turning around, looking beyond the compound to the heavy darkness of the forest and the clearing with the bloody stone. A thin scream cut across the air. It was a scream of wild terror, so uncontrolled that it made Polly shudder. It was repeated. Was there already someone at the terrible altar stone? Someone facing a sharp knife? She tried to find the source of the scream. She saw Zachary struggling, screaming, held by two men of the tribe. He was trying to break away from them, but they had him firmly between them, taking him toward Tynak. A faint light began to show at the far horizon of the lake. "No!" Zachary screamed. "You can't kill her! I didn't mean it! I didn't! You can't do it! You can't!" He was babbling with terror. "I'll die! Kill me! Kill me! You can't hurt her!" He saw Polly, and suddenly he was convulsed with sobs. "I didn't mean it! I was wrong! Oh, stop them! Somebody stop them! Let me die! Don't let them hurt Polly!" Tynek came up to him and slapped him across the mouth. Too late. Zachary was shocked into silence. He tried to pull one hand away to wipe his mouth, but the two men held his arms, and a trickle of blood slid down his chin. "The sacrifice must be unblemished," Tynak said. "You are not worthy." Polly was as cold as when she had swum across the lake. Not only her body seemed frozen, but her thoughts, her heart. The healer stood, helping himself up by pressing one hand against Polly's shoulder. Then he kept it there in a gesture of protection. Clep pushed himself up into a sitting position. Polly saw, without really taking it in, that he had a curved knife at his belt, which he now took out and held firmly. "Tynak, I warn you," he started, but Tynak raised his hand threateningly. With his position of authority as chief of the tribe, he did not need a weapon, and Clep, with his broken leg held stiffly between two staves, could not move. Tynak gestured contemptuously to the two guards who held the struggling Zachary. They dropped him as though he were a dead beast. He fell to the ground, whimpering. The guards came to Polly. They looked at the healer, but he did not take his hand from her shoulder. Polly did not recognize these men, who were not Winter Frost or Dark Swallow. Murmuring what sounded like an apology, one of the guards moved the healer's hand, not roughly, then jerked Polly away. "Stop!" Clep shouted. "Stop!" But he could only watch in frustration and rage as the men dragged Polly toward Tynak. "Tynak," Clep warned, "if you hurt her, it will be disaster for the tribe." "Blood," the people screamed. "Blood for the gods, blood for the ground, blood for rain, blood for growth, blood for life." The wind rose, making the flaring torches smoke. The moon began to lift out of the lake, enormous, red as blood. Polly thought her heart would stop beating. The people shouted, stamping their feet rhythmically in time to the drums, in time to their calls for blood. Zachary's thin wails were no more than a wisp of smoke. "Blood," the people chanted. "Blood! Blood!" Slowly, Polly was being dragged across the compound and toward the path, through the forest that led to the terrible stone. Zachary lurched to his feet and threw himself at Polly. One of the guards struck him, and he fell again to the ground, mewling like a sick child. "Look!" Clep cried, his shout rising above the noise of the mob. "Tynak, people, look to the lake. Do you not see?" There were shouts of surprise, of terror. Polly looked, struggling to stand upright. Silhouetted against the great orb of the moon was a large canoe with carved and curved ends. As the canoe came closer, she could see two men in it. Holding a great paddle was Corrales, with Og standing proudly by him. Standing in the prow was Bishop Calubra, with Louise the Larger twined about his arm in great shining coils. "See!" Clep cried triumphantly. "The goddess is called, and they come." "Do you dare touch the goddess?" The guards released Polly, recoiling in fear. "Bishop! Corrales!" Polly raced to the shore. Tynak was not far behind. The bishop and Corrales were dark silhouettes against the sky. Polly splashed into the water, trying to drag the canoe to the shore. Tynak gestured, and Dark Swallow and Winter Frost pulled the canoe up onto the pebbly beach. Suddenly, the moon was obliterated by a black cloud, which spread rapidly across the sky, blotting out the stars. The wind gusted, sending smoke guttering from the torches. Cries of fear and confusion came from the people. "An omen!" Clep called. "Heed the omen!" Corrales sprang from the canoe, then helped the bishop out. The old man's legs were wobbly, and he leaned on the druid. Louise the Larger clung to him in tight coils. The healer came up to them, peering first at Corrales, then at the bishop, whose face was suddenly illuminated by a startling flash of lightning. It was followed almost immediately by thunder, rolling wildly between the two chains of mountains, those of the people of the wind and those of the people across the lake. Then the rain came, at first spattering in heavy drops into the water, onto the beach, the skins of the tents. Then it came in great sheets, almost as though the waters of the lake were rising to meet the rain clouds. When Corrales and Tav had been blown by the storm of the people of the wind, the rainbow had arched across the sky and been seen as an omen. Rain had been threatening for days, and now it had come, but the people across the lake did not accept it as a natural result of clouds and wind patterns, a storm born of a cloud blown by a wind that veered around and came at them from the east, followed by downdrafts producing great charges of static electricity, which birthed fierce bolts of lightning and roaring thunder. The storm was seen by the people across the lake as a wonder brought by the bishop and the snake, by Corrales and the dog, and by Polly, who had summoned them. "To the tents!" Tynak cried, and people began to run, women gathering up their children, scurrying across the compound. Tynak held his face up to the rain, his mouth open, swallowing rain in great gulps. The healer led the bishop to Polly's lean-to, and she and Corrales followed. "Oh, Bishop," she cried. "Oh, Corrales, thank you, and you too, Louise. Og, oh, thank you." Klep was already soaked by the downpour, and Corrales helped the healer and Polly drag the young man to shelter. Zachary was still huddled on the ground, the rain pelting down on him. Nobody seemed to notice him. Polly looked at the bishop. Everyone was dripping rain. Louise the Larger had retired to the farthest corner of the lean-to. The lightning flashed again, hissing as it struck water. When the thunder came, she ran out to Zachary. "Zach, get up. Come." "Let me die," he moaned. "Don't be dramatic. Come on, it's raining. There isn't going to be any sacrifice." Zach tried to burrow into the hard ground. "Let me alone," she pulled at him. But he was a dead weight, and she could not move him. "Zach, get up!" Corrales was at her side. Between them, they raised Zachary to his feet. "Come on, Zach," Polly urged. "Just get away from the lightning." She flinched as it struck again, thunder roaring on top of it. Corrales helped her drag Zachary to the lean-to. When they let him go, he fell to the ground and curled up in fetal position. "Leave him be," Bishop Calubra said gently. The rain continued to sweep from the lake across the village. The lean-to was small protection, but the rain was warm. Lightning arrowed down, striking into the lake, onto the rocks of the shore. There was a horrible crackling sound, and then a crashing which echoed as loud as thunder. "A tree," Klep said. "The lightning has hit a tree." Slowly the storm moved off. Polly counted 5 beats between lightning flash and thunder, then 10. Then the lightning was only a general illuminating of the sky at the horizon. The thunder was only a distant rumbling. Tynak came to them, holding his palms out to show that he was weaponless. He bowed to Corrales and to Polly. "You brought rain." His voice was odd. "No, Tynak, rain came. I did not bring it." But there was no way she could make Tynak believe that the rain had not come because of her powers. Polly was a goddess who brought rain. She did not like the role of goddess. Bishop, she implored. The bishop was sitting on the pallet. The clouds had gone with the storm, and a flash of moonlight entered the lean-to and struck the topaz of his ring. "It is enough that the rain has come," he said to Tynak. "We do not need to understand." "You are healer?" Tynak asked. "Not as your healer is healer, or as Corrales, but that has been my aim, yes." Tynak looked at him, looked past him to Louise the Larger, coiled in the shadows, then nodded at Corrales. "You will come?" Corrales nodded. "Polly, too?" "Where?" Polly asked. To hold council," Corrales said. "It is meet." "Zachary?" "Zachary will wait." There was neither condemnation nor contempt in Corrales' voice. "Bishop Heron," Corrales said, "it is fitting that you come too." He held out his hand to help the bishop to his feet. "I go too," Klep announced. Klep had authority. Ultimately, he would be the leader of the tribe. Winterfrost and Dark Swallow were summoned to help him. "Klep," Polly demurred, "you promised Anirul you'd be careful. This is going to be terribly hard on your leg." "I go," Klep insisted. There was still a tension of electricity in the air. Clouds were building up again, scudding past the brilliance of the moon, so that light was followed by shadow, shadow by light, making strange patterns as they walked. When they reached the end of the path that led to the clearing, they were blocked. A great oak, the tree the lightning had struck, lay uprooted across the path. There was no way they could get across it to the clearing with the rock. Corrales went to the felled tree, putting his hand on the enormous trunk. Og leaped up to stand at his side. Tynak drew back, but only slightly, standing his ground. "This tree will do for our meeting place," Corrales said. "The goddess," Tynak bowed toward Polly. "She has great and mysterious powers." "I am not," Polly started, but Corrales raised his hand and she stopped. Corrales' eyes regarded her calmly, their blue bright as sapphires in the moonlight. "Polly, it is fitting that you tell Tynak the terms of our peace." She looked at him, totally unprepared. His face was serene. The stone in his torque burned like fire. She swallowed, breathed, swallowed. Then she turned to Tynak. "There will be no more raiding. If you are hungry, if you need food, you will send Klep when he can walk again to speak with Corrales. The people of the wind are people of peace. They will share what they have. They will show you how to irrigate so that your land will yield better crops. And, if sometime they are in need, you will give to them. The people of the wind and the people across the lake are to live as one people." She paused. Had he understood? He stood beside Corrales, nodding. She continued, "To seal this promise, and with Anarel's consent, she and Clep will be," there was no word for marry or marriage, "will be made one, to live together, to guard the peace. Clep?" "That is my wish." Clep's smile was radiant. Tynak stood looking at Polly, at Corrales, who was leaning against the fallen body of the great tree, at Clep, held upright between Winter Frost and Dark Swallow. Polly said, "These are our terms. Do you accept?" "I accept." Tynak suddenly seemed old. "Clep, I accept. Gladly, Anarel and I will seek to bring peace and healing to both sides of the lake." Polly felt a small nudge in her ribs. The healer was poking her. "Blood," he said. She nodded. She did not know why she understood what he meant, but she did. Perhaps because of childhood stories about blood brothers and sisters. She took the gold knife the bishop had given Anarel, then opened the notebook to a fresh page. She flipped out the blade, which was bright and clean, looked at Tynak. "Hold out your hand." Without question, he held his hand out to her. She took the knife and nicked the flesh of the ball of his middle finger, then squeezed it till a drop of blood appeared. Then she smeared it on the clean page of the notebook. Corrales, he too, without question, held out his hand, and she repeated the procedure, then blended the 2 drops of blood on the page. "This is the seal and sign of our terms of peace." She took the page, then reached for the scissors and carefully cut the page in half, so that there was mingled blood on each piece of paper. One piece she handed to Corrales, the other to Tynak. Then she took the cut sketch of Tynak and handed him one half and the other to Corrales. "This is the sign that you will never break the peace. If you do, Corrales has your power." Again, Tynak clutched his chest as though in pain. "Corrales will never hurt you," Polly said. "Only you can hurt yourself." She felt infinitely weary. "I would like to go now, back across the lake." The healer nudged her. "Zach." She was too tired to think of Zachary. "What?" the bishop reminded her. "There is the matter of Zachary." She leaned against the fallen tree. She was too tired to even stand any longer. The bishop continued. "You came back here to the people across the lake because of Zachary. However, you can forget about him now if you wish." "Oh, can I, Bishop? Can I?" She never wanted to think of Zachary again, but she pushed away from the fallen tree. "We'll go back to him. I suppose he's still in the lean-to." The procession moved back toward the village. Winter Frost and Black Swallow supporting Clep so that he could hop without any strain on his injured leg. People were beginning to emerge from their tents. The air, cleansed by storm, felt fresh and fragrant. Now they looked at Polly with wondering awe. Zachary was still huddled under the lean-to. She knelt down beside him, put her hand to his cheek, turning him so that she could look into his eyes. He squeezed his eyelids tight. She turned to the bishop. "I think he's decompensated," she said. I think he's beyond us." "No," Bishop Kalubra said. "Never say that, Polly." The healer knelt on Zachary's other side. Zachary whimpered. The bishop said, "Often an alcoholic can start to recover only when they've gone all the way to the bottom, where there's no place else to go but up. Zachary's self-centeredness was an addiction just as deadly as alcoholism." He bent over the stricken young man. "Open your eyes." It was a stern command. Zachary's eyelids flickered. "Sit up," the bishop ordered. "You are not beyond redemption, Zachary." Zachary moaned. "I was willing to let Polly die." "But not when it came down to it, Zach," Polly cried. "You tried to stop them, but it was too late." Tears gushed out. "Look at me. I'm here. There will be no sacrifice." His terrified gaze met hers. "You're all right?" "I'm fine." He sat up. "I'll die if it will help you. I will. You don't need to, Zach. There is peace now on both sides of the lake." "But what I did, I can't be forgiven." He looked wildly from Polly to Tynak to the bishop. "Zachary," the bishop spoke softly but compellingly. "William Langland, riding around 1400, said, and all the wickedness in the world that a man might work or think is no more to the mercy of God than a live coal in the sea. Zachary shook his head. I went beyond mercy, he gasped, and the blueness around his lips deepened. The healer reached out and placed his palm on Zachary's chest. As Cub had steadied the bishop's breathing, so the healer steadied Zachary's. Help him, Tynak commanded. It would be a bad omen to have a death now. Corrales knelt and lifted Zachary so that the young man lay against his chest. With one arm, he supported him. His right hand reached under Zachary's wet clothes, and he nodded at the healer. The old man opened Zachary's jacket and shirt, baring his chest. Then his hands joined Corrales's, hovering delicately as though his ancient fingers were listening. Corrales breathed slowly, steadily, so that Zachary's limp body, held firmly against the druid's strong one, could feel and catch the rhythm. He looked at the bishop. Please. The bishop, too, knelt, placing his long, thin hands over Zachary's chest. The healer nodded at Polly. She lifted her hands, held them out, and then she was caught in the restoring power of the healer and Corrales and the bishop, their hands not touching but tenderly moving over Zachary's pale and flaccid chest. Again Polly felt the golden tingling, and then a stab of acute pain went through her body like lightning, eased off, leaving her weak and trembling. Again came the warmth, the gold. Corrales's hands seemed to have a life of their own. They hovered like bird wings, like a firebrand. His eyes changed from their serene blue to the burning gold of the stone in his torque, and the faint lines in his face deepened. He was far older than Polly had realized. She felt that her hands, her eyes, her mind, her whole body was caught in the electric power which Corrales and the healer and the bishop were sending through Zachary. They were, she felt, mending his heart, but far more than his heart. The depth of the healing was not merely physical, but poured through the core of Zachary himself. Time shimmered, stopped. Polly was not sure that she was breathing or that her heart was beating. Everything was focused on Zachary. Tynak let out a hissing sound, and time began again. Polly could feel the steady beating of her heart. The tingling warmth left her hands. But this time they were not cold, but warm and dry. Corrales sat back on his heels, Zachary still leaning against him. It is well, the healer breathed. Corrales smiled. It went well. The bishop rose, looking down at Zachary. It is well. Now Polly too sat back. Zachary? The blue was gone from his lips. He stammered. Hush, the bishop said. You don't need to say anything. He looked at Corrales. It will do, Corrales said. It is not perfect, but it will do. Much power, the healer said. Great, good power. He looked at Og, who was sitting watching, ears pricked high, at Louise the Larger, who was lying quietly, coiled into a circle. All work together. Good. Am I all right? Zachary's voice trembled. Not perfect, the bishop said, but Corrales tells us your heart will do. Yes. A touch of color came to his cheeks. I don't know what to say. Nothing. But I was willing to let Polly die, and you still helped me. You will not do Polly or any of us any good by holding on to your guilt. You will help by taking proper care of yourself. There is more to be renewed than your heart. I know. Oh, this time I know. Come. Corrales stood. The storm is over. Now there is rain. The clouds deepened and rain fell, soft, penetrating rain, quenching the thirst of the parched earth. Now winter wheat could be planted, the ground prepared for spring. Let us cross the lake, Corrales said. Aniral, Cub, Tav are all anxiously waiting. Tynak and the healer escorted them to the canoe. Clep, helped by winter frost and dark swallows, stood on the shore and waved goodbye. To Aniral you will give my love. Now that Clep had learned the word love, his face glowed with joy each time he said it. The healer raised his arm in blessing. Come, Tynak said to the healer and Clep. At the 6th of the moon we will invite them, all the tribe, for a feast. They will not mind that the food has come from them. Corrales laughed, and winter frost and dark swallows splashed into the water, pushing the canoe until it floated free. Cub and Anarol were waiting eagerly to greet them, and ran into the lake to help pull up the canoe. Once ashore, Polly found that she was trembling so that she could hardly walk. Cub put his arm around her and led her into Corrales' tent. "You have given too much." He helped her onto one of the fern beds. Where was Tav, she wondered. The bishop looked at her lovingly. "The virtue has been drained from her. It will return." "I don't want to be a goddess anymore," Polly said. Anarol brought her a warm drink, and she sipped, letting it slide down her throat and warm her whole body. "Clep," Anarol said. "He is all right," Polly assured her. "Truly all right? He has moved his leg more than he should. But he's all right. He loves you, Annie." A gentle drifting of color moved over her cheeks. "I am so glad, so glad." She reached out and pressed Polly's hand. Polly returned the pressure, then looked around for Tav and realized that not only did she not see Tav, she did not see Zachary. "Where's Zachary?" she asked. "With Corrales." Cub squatted by Polly, taking her wrist in his gentle fingers, letting it fall only after he was satisfied. "Don't let him come here," Polly implored. Cub looked at her questioningly. "I don't want to see him." If she had to do it all over again, she would do the same thing. She would go back across the lake. She would hold her hands with the healer and Corrales and the bishop over Zachary's heart. But now it was done. It was done, and there was nothing left except an exhaustion that was far more than physical. The bishop smiled at Polly. "I have a great question that will never be answered. Did the time gate open for me, and then for Polly because of Zachary?" Corrales entered as the bishop spoke. "Who knows for whom the time gate opened?" His voice was quiet. "What has happened here, in this time, may have some effect we do not know and cannot even suspect. Here in my time, perhaps, or perhaps in yours. Let us not try to understand the pattern, only rejoice in its beauty." Was Zachary part of the beauty, Polly wondered, but she was too exhausted to speak. "Cub," Corrales turned. "Will you go to Zachary, please, and stay with him?" Cub nodded and left, obediently, just as Tav burst into the tent. "Polly!" He rushed to her. "Tav!" Tav knelt on the packed earth in front of her, raised one hand, and gently touched her lips. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Truly?" "Truly, Tav." There was a deep sadness in her heart. She would not see Tav again, and that was grief. "And that Zach?" Tav demanded. "He is all right, too." Tav scowled. "He would have let you be killed, but he didn't. He wanted to. Not really, Tav. He is not worth one hair of your head." Anarol nodded. "I am still very angry with him." "Annie," the bishop chided gently, "you do not think that all that Polly went through was for the sake of Zachary's physical heart?" "I don't know." Anarol's voice was low. "It is Polly I care about, not Zachary." "Don't care?" "Bishop, maybe his heart, she touched her chest, "is better, but what about the part of his heart that would let Polly be sacrificed? Her life for his. Change is always possible," the bishop said. Anarol looked rebellious. "For Zach, who helped kidnap Polly, who would have let her be put on the altar stone, who would not have stopped the knife, can he change? Can he?" "Can you truly say that change is not possible? Can you refuse him that chance? Can you say that only his physical heart was healed?" Tav growled. "He would have harmed my Polly." "Zachary hit bottom," the bishop said. "It was an ugly bottom, yes, but in the pit he saw himself." Tav pounded his spear angrily on the ground. The bishop continued. "Now it is up to him." Anarol scowled. The bishop smiled. "Your anger won't last, Annie. You are warm of heart." "Polly is back." Tav reached out again to touch her. "Polly is back. That is all that matters. I do not think about that Zach. I think about Polly, and that the rain has come. Yes. And now you will go." He held out his hands to her with longing. She sighed deeply. "To my own time, Tav, if the threshold is open." And Zachary? Tav demanded. Do you have to take him with you? At last, Polly laughed. Do you want him here? Tav scowled. He did not want my Polly out of obedience to the mother, or for any good save his own. The bishop looked around the tent. When Zachary saw Annie, he entered the circles of overlapping time. Behold, I have set before you an open door, and no man can shut it. Words of power, Corrales said. Yes, the bishop agreed. From John's revelation. And is the door to stay open, Bishop? Anarel asked. No, Annie, no, but it was wide open when Polly made the decision to return across the lake to Zachary. And you must honor that decision. He turned to Polly. You were very brave, my dear. I wasn't brave, I was terrified. But you went ahead and did what you had to do. Og reached out and licked her fingers. Cub opened the tent flap and came in with Zachary. It is time. Polly looked at Zachary and felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no love. Yes, Corrales said, it is time. Zachary stood between Corrales and Cub, his face pale, but there was no blueness to his lips. I don't know what to say. Then don't speak, Corrales said. Zachary looked from one to the other. What I did was beyond apology. You were out of your mind with self, Corrales said. Now you must understand that though your life has been lengthened, ultimately you will die to this life. It is the way of the mortal. Yes, Zachary said, I know that now. And in you there is still much healing to be accomplished. I know. Zachary was as subdued as a small child after a spanking. But he was not a small child. I will try. He turned to Polly. May I come see you? Her hand stroked Og's head. No, Zachary, I'm sorry, I don't want to see you again. It wouldn't be a good idea for either of us. Her voice was level, emotionless. She had to go back across the lake for Zachary. But what had to be done had to be done. But there are things which you have to learn. There are things which you have to learn alone, Corrales said. One is that you have to live with yourself. I don't like myself, Zachary said. You must learn to. The bishop's words were a command. From this moment on, your behavior must be such that when you go to bed at night, you will be happy with what you have done during the day. Can that happen? Zachary asked. He looked at Polly. Can it? Yes, Zachary, it can happen if you will let it. Louise the larger slid across the packed earth out of the tent. Follow her, Corrales ordered. Tav went to Polly, speaking longingly. I must let you go? From your presence, Corrales said, not from your heart. Now I know, Tav said softly. I was wrong about the mother. The mother asks the sacrifice of love. You have shown me that. He touched Polly's lips with his finger and turned quickly away. Anarel stretched her hands out toward Polly, but did not touch her. We will always be friends, always. And Clep and I will hold you in our hearts. You will be in mine. The lines of love crossed time and space, but a tear slid down Anarel's cheek. Corrales turned toward Polly, took both her hands in his. We will never forget you, nor I you. And Bishop Heron, when you came to us through the time gate, you started it all. The bishop smiled. I, Corrales? Oh, I think not. At the entrance to the tent, Og barked impatiently. Corrales stroked Og's head, then said, I will send Og with you, Polly. You and your grandparents have need of a good guardian dog, and Og is that. Again Og barked, imperiously. Come, Bishop Kalubra led the way out of the tent. Polly followed him, and Og nudged his cold nose into her hand. Behind them, the lake shimmered. The white peaks of the mountains reached sharply into the sky. When they reached the stone wall, Louise the larger was lying in a warm splash of sunlight. She raised herself up, then slithered down between the rocks. Polly looked around. The trees were their own young trees. The grandfather oak, overshadowing them all, the snow-capped mountains were gone, and the ancient hills lay quietly on the horizon. She was back in her own time. Someone must have been keeping watch. The Murrays and Dr. Louise came running through the apple orchard across the field, running to greet them. There was much hugging, tears of relief, joyous barking from Og. Zachary stood quietly apart. Then Polly's grandparents urged them all into the kitchen. The warmth, the scent of applewood, the geraniums, and freshly baked bread. Polly and the bishop started to speak at once, telling their own versions of what had happened. Zachary stood in silence. Then Dr. Louise had her stethoscope out, listening to Zachary's heart. "There appears to be a slight murmur," she said at last. "I'm not sure how much clinical improvement it has. Certainly it is not a perfect heart. You will need to check in with your own doctors as soon as possible." "I will, but there's a difference. I can breathe without feeling I'm lifting weights. Thanks, doctor, all of you." He went to Polly and took both her hands. "Polly." He looked at her, but said nothing more. She waited, letting him hold her hands. He opened his mouth as though to speak, closed it, shook his head. "You will," she started, stopped. "Yes, Polly, I will." He withdrew his hands. "I'd better go now." Polly said, "I'll go out to the car with you." The bishop put his hands on Zachary's shoulder. "It will not be easy, I know. Remember that the lines of love are always there. You may hold on to them." "I will, thanks. God go with you." "I don't believe in God." "That's all right, I do. I'm glad." Polly walked with Zachary through the gate and to the lane where he had parked his car. He got in, rolled down the window. "Polly," she looked at him. He shrugged. "Sorry. Thanks. Words aren't good enough." "That's okay. Just take care." She plunged her hands into the anorak pockets and her fingers touched Zachary's angel icon. She pulled it out. "You still have my icon." "Yes, I always will." She put the icon back. The bishop came out, walking rapidly across the lawn on his heron's legs. "Come, dear one, let's go into the house." "Goodbye," Zachary said. "Polly, you have on that sheepskin tunic." She ran her hands lightly over the warm fleece that hung well below the anorak. "Hannibal's tunic. I can't return it, can I?" The bishop smiled. "She would want you to have it, for herself and Clep, for the good memories." Zachary looked at Polly, at the bishop, rolled up the window, started the ignition, waved one hand, drove off. The bishop put his arm around Polly and they started back toward the house. To all these people, Polly loved. But there were others she loved too, and she would never see them again. "What happens to what's happened?" she asked the bishop. "It's there, waiting." "But the time gate's closed, isn't it?" "Yes, but that can't take away what we've had, the good and the bad." Again, her fingers touched the angel icon. She looked across the fields to the low shoulders of the ancient hills. It seemed that flickering dimly behind them, she could see the jagged snow-topped peaks of mountains. They went into the house. And that is the end of An Acceptable Time. And it is also the end of Madeleine L'Engle's Time Quintet, of which I have only read you one other book, which was Many Waters. Now, there is one other Polly book which I have not read, which is House Like a Lotus, which I did order to read you on this channel. However, I should probably read Wrinkle in Time, even though I kind of said I would never read it because it's too popular of a book and you could probably find better readings of it than I have done. But this was so complimentary to Wrinkle in Time, was An Acceptable Time. It's almost the mirror image of that book with all that happens in between, and I would really kind of like to go back and read that. But it is up to you which Madeleine L'Engle I will read next. House Like a Lotus, I could do Wrinkle in Time, I could do Wind in the Door, I could do Swiftly Tilting Planet. It will take me longer to get Wrinkle in Time because I've read that book so many times it's fallen apart. Right now the copy I have of it is Hope Larson's graphic adaptation of it, but I will order up a nice hardcover to read to you on this channel because I think it is important to do that one day. It's funny, I said this wasn't going to be a dog book, but I didn't realize that Og would play such an important part in this story, and maybe he stayed with the Murray family. If you're listening to this out of sequence, I think that's interesting that Zachary in this story is kind of the shadow of Calvin, who is Polly's father in A Wrinkle in Time. Calvin meets the Murray family and he becomes a member of that family, and he and Meg kind of seal the lines between themselves. In this, whatever connection that Polly and Zachary had breaks, and Zachary has to live with himself. But what I liked about this story, as opposed to how Harry Potter ends, is Voldemort tells Harry, when they find the baby Voldemort in the train station, that Voldemort is irredeemable, even that child Voldemort. And in this, Polly wants to think that Zachary is irredeemable, but the bishop, just like the doctor in Doctor Who, says, we never say that. And this was a very, very Christian book, which kind of surprised me. There's so much Christ in it. Jesus is only mentioned once in A Wrinkle in Time, and I think of the two adaptations, one of them does not even mention Jesus in that, which is okay. It works for Wrinkle in Time, but for the scope of this story, for the Time Quintet, you do need the presence of Christ in that story. And I know that a lot of you that listen to this are homeschooled, that you are religious, and I would never push any kind of religion on you. Me, myself, I grew up in a religious tradition that I am no longer associated with, but I still see the beauty of that in story. And I can see a lot of parallels with what I just read to C.S. Lewis, who is not an author I will probably read on this channel. Probably not the Chronicles of Narnia, at least. Maybe I will read his book Till We Have Faces, which is about the myth of Cupid and Psyche. But yeah, the end of this reminds me a lot of how The Silver Chair ended. It reminds me of what happened to Eustace in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is funny because that's how Philip Pullman, another one of my favorite authors, was either him or Neil Gaiman, saw that, and that, moved them away from Christianity as they grew older, which is also, to get personal, I also moved away from that, finding those patterns in stories and learning new ways to tell them. And maybe, to go back to Harry Potter, that is something that we can give J.K. Rowling credit for, is that she found a new way to tell that kind of a story by not having Voldemort be redeemable, even as, the red infant that was lying under the bench in the train station. I think this is the most I have ever had to say stream of consciousness about a book that I read you on this channel. I think our next read aloud is going to be easier. Like I said, it's going to be a dog book. I hopefully will be able to record that video today. This last part of the book lasted almost an hour with this long ramble that I have gone on. But thank you, listeners, for sticking with this channel, leaving comments. I would love to debate what I've said with you in the comment section for this video, but until then, I will see you in whatever short story I end up reading. And again, if you're watching this out of sequence, hopefully I have read you the rest of the Time Quintet, and it is up to you what I will read next. The choices are House Like a Lotus, which is about Polly, and then the other choices are all about Polly's mom and dad, about Meg and Calvin. There's Wrinkle in Time, the first book in the series, Wind in the Door, the second book in the series, and Swiftly Tilting Planet, the third book in the series. And I will happily do those out of sequence, just like I did these out of sequence, based on what you want to hear. So I will see you in the next read aloud.